Retro vs. Remake. Ruby, Sapphire, and Emerald versus Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire.
Hey everyone, I'm Prince B, and normally I do reviews on this channel, but recently Pokemon Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire came out, and I wanted to do a video talking about them. Obviously, that was a few weeks ago now, so I'm a little bit late. Oops. I kind of got sidetracked playing them, and I've done just about everything now, so well, I guess I'm able to talk about everything at this point. I've thought about doing a regular review, but I just didn't really want to. I didn't want to do a regular review. I thought instead what would be more interesting is, since these are remakes of the original Game Boy Advance titles, Pokemon Ruby and Sapphire, that I would basically do a video discussing what's new and what's old from the original games, kind of a compare and contrast, and just give my opinion on them. It's kind of a free form, free script, not really a scripted review like I normally do, and I just thought it'd be interesting. Obviously, there will be spoilers, so if you haven't played them yet and are still intending to, you may want to avoid this. With that out of the way, let's get started.
Now, being up front, I didn't care for the Hoenn games, so I don't have a lot of bias here. Don't get me wrong, they were good games, but I started on Diamond, so going back to play them afterwards, the Generation 3 games felt a little bit sluggish. If I had started with them, I'm sure I would have liked them just as much as everyone else, but I didn't, so I don't have a lot of bias towards these games as opposed to any of the other games. With that in mind, let's begin. First, let's start with the most obvious changes: graphics and audio. Graphically speaking, everything looks great. Everything's been brought up from the original sprites that were on the Game Boy Advance games and done in the 3D models that were used in X and Y, and it just looks gorgeous. Hoenn itself has been remade pretty faithfully, with only a few places getting changes, most notably in some gyms, Victory Road, and Granite Cave. Other than that, most of the places are pretty much exact replicas, only in 3D instead of 2D. So, pretty good there. So, everything looks and feels just like it should. In terms of music, all the old pieces are brought back and remastered. They just sound cleaner and nicer, and that's great. There are a few new pieces made specifically for this game, in particular Wally's theme and a few of the songs used in the Delta episode. And even the new songs sound really great and they fit, so no real complaints there. With those things out of the way, let's talk about actual features, both new and old, from the original games. In terms of new and returning features, one of the most obvious is the new PokeNav Plus, which is displayed on the bottom screen. While it can't make phone calls, it does display a map, a TV function where you can get updates about your character or people that you street pass, the PSS, Super Training, and Pokemon and Me features from X and Y, and most interestingly, the new Dex Nav. The Dex Nav lets you see what Pokemon you've encountered in the area, letting you keep a running list, as well as having a radar feature that you can level up. As you level it up by encountering multiple of the same type of Pokemon, it gets better and gives you the ability to see which Pokemon you'll encounter next, the IVs, the ability, its first move, and so on. You'll also get the ability to find Pokemon with their hidden abilities, perfect IVs, and even egg moves in the wild, keeping encounters interesting, especially in the first few routes where you only have a very small number of Pokemon to choose from. You can in particular get, say, a Poochyena with its egg move Fire Fang, which makes it a lot more interesting than just running into the same Poochyena with Bite or Tackle or whatever on the first route. Going hand in hand with this is the new sneak feature, which you do with the circle pad. Unlike X and Y, where the circle pad let you use roller skates, you now pull it or push it very slightly to sneak, and this helps you reduce encounter rates as well as sneak up on Pokemon that you find with the Dex Nav's radar, which is really cool and helps you get through areas without a lot of Pokemon encounters. Speaking of encounters, while I can't confirm it, it does feel like the encounter rates have been lowered, so that's really useful, and we'll talk more about that in a little bit. In terms of features that were more side questy or just places you go to kill time, some of them made the cut and some didn't. One of the ones that didn't make it was the game corner. It's not here from the original Ruby and Sapphire games, and was cut most likely due to the problems with gambling that cut the game corner from other games like Heart Gold and Soul Silver. The Safari Zone does make a return, and it has been updated to be better. Instead of paying to run in and catch as many Pokemon as you can in a certain time limit with just regular Great Balls, you now get to just enter for free, take as much time as you want, and battle it just like you would any normal Pokemon. Secret bases also make a return, and remain more or less unchanged. You can still decorate the area and have battles with the trainers that you link up with. However, now, instead of relying on the Game Boy Advance link cables, which were clunky and for whatever reason no one I knew had them, you now utilize the Street Pass and QR code features of the 3DS, making everything a lot easier and just making connectivity in general more accessible to the masses. Contests likewise make a return, and they look a lot better, but it still feels really similar to the Generation 3 contests. Contest stats are easier to raise now. There is no limit on how many Pokeblocks you can feed your Pokemon, which makes it a lot easier to max out a stat, and that in particular helps with a certain famous Pokemon who was known for being really difficult to evolve, Feebas. Feebas evolved into Milotic via its beauty rating, and while it can still do that, it also had introduced a new method of evolution in Generation 5, the Prism Scale, which you trade it while holding the Prism Scale and it evolves. Now it can have access to both those features, either evolution through beauty or evolution with the Prism Scale, and now with that you can now get Milotic even if you don't have the ability to trade, which is really cool. Speaking of Feebas, Feebas is just easier to find now, as you can find it on any water tile 5% of the time on the river in Route 119, instead of just a few select tiles. One other thing that was in the original game was collecting soot to create glass items like flutes and secret base decorations, and this is where I feel they kinda messed it up a little. They brought it back, but they made it a bit harder in that there are only like 7 soot piles on the route that you can collect soot on, and you have to run through these piles and you get a random amount of soot between like 1 and 100 like units of it, and it feels messy because it's randomized and you can't really keep track without going in and talking to the guy who makes the glass items, and he just tells you how much you need. He doesn't tell you how much you have. In the old version, you could just run through any piece of grass and you'd collect soot, and it just felt better back then. It's still here and it's still doable, but I just feel like they made it a little bit more clunky and hard to gauge than it needed to be. Being that these games are remakes of the older games that aim to take them and bring them back into the franchise and tie them in with the new features introduced in the newer games, obviously there are going to be things introduced from the new games and not just Ruby, Sapphire, and Emerald. Briefly, I want to talk about a few of those. Carryovers from X and Y include the experience share, which functions identically to X and Y rather than the old one that was a hold item in Ruby, Sapphire, and Emerald, and you get it fairly early. You can still turn it on or off if you want, so if you do like the challenge, you still have the option to turn that off. Mega Evolutions obviously make a return as well, and were one of the huge showcasings that got everyone excited for the game. There are no secret hidden Mega Evolutions that weren't revealed ahead of time, and most of them are are available prior to the Elite Four, but you do have to complete most of the main storyline to have access to them. However, when it comes to Megastone hunting, there's no longer a time restriction, which is really good, and because not everyone was able to get on and look for Megastones at a specific time. Well, it was like something between 8 and 9 o'clock. So now you can hunt for Megastones at any time, and also all the Megastones are in both games, rather than being split like they were in X and Y. Also, the Pokeball capture experience returns. You still get experience if you capture a Pokemon, not just for fainting them. And lastly, one feature that I was really excited for but didn't make the cut was customization. I know that since these are remakes, it doesn't make too much sense to have the customization return, but it would have been nice since that was one of my favorite features from X and Y. Not a big deal, but still one that I'm a little disappointed in. Obviously, with these games being brought forward into the new generations, they had to update the Pokédex, and in that regard, very few changes were made to the Hoenn-Dex. For the most part, the Pokédex is left unchanged, but they did add the Generation 4 evolutions and pre-evolutions such as Dusknoir, Gallade, Roserade, and Badoo, just to make it easy or make it possible to get those Pokemon prior to upgrading to the National Dex. However, while you are limited on what you can catch to those Pokemon that are in the Hoenn Dex prior to getting the upgrade, you can trade non-Hoenn Pokemon over without the National Dex. So if you want to fight with a team of all Pokemon from X and Y, you are welcome to do so as long as you have access to trading. With that, most of the route encounters have not been updated for the main storyline, while you can unlock additional Pokemon on the routes that aren't in the Hoenn Dex via the Dex Nav. That does not come until after obtaining the National Dex. So the route encounters are still the same. The lack of updated route encounters really stands out in one place, and that is the water routes. One of the reasons I didn't care for the games originally was how much water there was and how boring these routes were, because most of the time you would encounter a Tentacool or a Wingull or what have you. There wasn't a lot of variety on these routes, and it just felt slow and tedious to navigate. In fact, as everyone knows and has been making fun of lately, IGN gave the games a lower rating based off of how much water there was. Obviously, the water is part of Hoenn as a region itself, and it would be ridiculous to expect them to take that out of the game. As such, I'm not counting against them how much water is still there. What instead I'm looking at is it easier or faster to navigate? Are the encounter rates better? And is there a larger variety of Pokemon? Well, surfing does feel faster, and the encounter rates do seem lower, but the variety of Pokemon is unchanged, so it is still kind of boring to navigate, but you get through faster and without as much trouble, so I'd say overall they did a good job handling it. Some other cool functions that are new to the games would be that you can fly to any location you've been to, including routes and caves, not just towns. This is really useful if you want to get to, say, Meteor Falls, and you don't want to go all the way to the nearest town and walk there. You can just go directly there, as long as you've been there already before. Also, later into the main game, you get the ability to fly freely, all over Hoenn without going from point A to point B. This addition, in addition to just being really cool on its own, means that you don't require to have a flyer in your party at all times to travel. Of post-game content, well, it's not something exclusive to the post-game. Rematching trainers is back through the Trainer's Eyes function of the Pokénav Plus. But sadly, one of the most anticipated things was gym leader rematches, which don't make a return. While I'm aware that that was an Emerald feature, it would have been nice to see since they're just bringing these games up into the newer games. Uh, with that said, the Elite Four do get stronger teams after the main storyline, so that keeps things a little bit more interesting if you do subsequent runs fighting them. Also, the Delta episode, which was advertised as being this big epic adventure, kind of isn't. It's more of a glorified fetch quest with you just going to point A to pick up an item and taking it back to point B and then going to point C and then returning to point B and then going back to point A. And it's kind of not very fun. You do get a lot of story stuff though, and the last third of it is really interesting and just really cool, so it is definitely worth it. And also, once you finish that, you get access to the battle facility of the game, which is not the battle frontier. It's just literally the battle mason from X and Y pasted over on Hoenn. They try and explain it, but it doesn't really work too well. Uh, it's kind of boring, but you do get your move tutors and your items there. Uh, Overall, it would have been nice to see at least, even if not the battle frontier, just something different from the battle mason that we already all beat back in X and Y last year. But they can't do everything, so okay. Uh, you also get a lot of legends that you can hunt, uh, and breeding in the post game is a lot easier than the main game because on the Battle Resort Island they put a daycare, an extra daycare, so you technically have two daycares. You can have Pokemon breeding in both those daycares, but personally I only use the Battle Resort one. It actually has an infinite loop similar to the one in Lumio City for hatching eggs, and there's an IV checker right next to it, so you can check the IVs of your Pokemon. It's just really convenient, so that's a really good thing they did. And of course, minor things that they did, they just left in a lot of the references that made Hoenn feel unique. Like the most notably is the one where you talk to the boy and he asks you which town you're from, and your only options in typical RPG style are yes and no, and he makes a joke based on which one you choose. Uh, just minor things that they kept in from the original, and it's just overall great.
That's just about everything in these games. I didn't cover everything, but I got most of it. There are a few minor features that I glossed over, but you can experience them yourself when you play them. Uh, Overall, I think that they're great games. They did a great job of bringing Hoenn into the new generation and cleaning everything up. A few things were a little clunky or made worse from the original, but overall, I'd say they were great. Uh, Definitely more interesting to me personally than the original games. I feel like I'm finally experiencing the same region that everyone else experienced when they were growing up and fell in love with. And that's great. I'm glad that I'm able to do that. The only real question now is it time for Kanto remakes? Or is it time for everyone to start saying Sinnoh confirmed?
Thank you as always for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, go ahead, give it a like or subscribe if you haven't already. And if you're interested in more Pokemon Generation 3 related stuff, on my gameplay channel I did a video on a Pokemon Harvest Moon crossover type challenge. It's kind of interesting, so give it a look if you're interested in that. And again, thank you for watching.